A new film version of Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray was released earlier this month.
There he is. It's the young bloke who,
Yes.
but his picture kind of gets older. That's about the extent of my knowledge of
That
it.
little clip says it all, doesn't
That's
it?
it. You don't see the film. Somebody who watched with rather more interest was Gyles Brandreth, who, it turns out, is an authority on Wilde, really is, and is especially fascinated by the character of Dorian Gray.
There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. Those words, written by Oscar Wilde, would eventually come to haunt him. 120 years ago, in this dining room, he attended a dinner of some importance. An American publisher had come to London and was staying here at the Langham Hotel. He invited two up-and-coming young authors to join him. Their names, Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde. He invited both of them to write books for him, and Wilde wrote this, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Little did he know at the time the scandal it would come to cause him. The Picture of Dorian Gray was written in 1889 when Oscar Wilde was famous for being famous. He was a celebrity, a wit, a poet, a dandy, a noted man about town. It's this late Victorian world of high society and low life that Wilde captures in Dorian Gray. The story of a young man who retains his youth and beauty while the excesses of his hedonistic lifestyle appear in a portrait that is painted of him. If it were I who was to be always young, and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. I would give my soul for that. And Oscar Wilde himself began to lead a double life. Born in Dublin, he moved to London and lived here in Chelsea with his wife and two children. But at about the time he was writing The Picture of Dorian Gray, he started to live another life in the West End, a life that led to his imprisonment 6 years later for homosexual practices. Material from this book was used in the trials against him. I've come to Rupert Street in London's West End, a regular haunt of both Oscar Wilde and his character Dorian Gray. After you. Tell me about the London of Dorian Gray.
We get two aspects of London. We get the prosperous West End, the haunts of London society. We also get the other London, the London of Whitechapel and the East End and the docks. The problem of the East End was much talked about in Oscar's time because that was another world entirely.
Dorian Gray watched with listless eyes the sordid shame of the great city. There were opium dens where one could buy oblivion, dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed. In 1895, when the trials of Oscar Wilde begin, some of the content of this book is used in the trials against him.
In the first trial, the prosecution set out to blacken Oscar, one might say, blacken his character. In the course of the trials, Oscar was accused of writing an immoral book, the implication being that that made him an immoral man.
As I walk through central London today, The Picture of Dorian Gray seems almost more relevant than it did when it was written at the end of the 19th century. Our obsession with youth and beauty rivals that of Oscar Wilde. Dorian Gray, the feature film, has just been released. I've come to the Cadogan Hotel, where Oscar Wilde was arrested in 1895 to meet its director, Oliver Parker. So this is the room from which he was arrested.
The hotel says where he enjoyed his last few hours of freedom, which is another way of looking at the fact where this is the end of his freedom.
120 years after this was written, Oscar Wilde still speaks to us. Why?
He definitely has so much to say in terms of, I suppose, trying to carve out your own individuality by not being oppressed by the society around you that's calling the shots for most of us.
Oscar Wilde's rise to fame was extraordinary, and his fall from grace was catastrophic. He left this hotel to face the trials that led to his imprisonment. 2 years later, on his release, he left the country, never to return to London again. He died in 1900 in exile, aged only 46. And the tragedy began with this, The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Gyles, why did you fall in love with him in the first place?
I've been fascinated all my life. I was brought up in London, in Chelsea, and I lived, when I was a little boy, in a house opposite where Lady Wilde, Oscar Wilde's mother, lived. And that room there, the Cadogan Hotel, when I was quite a small boy, my father took me to take tea in the room in which Oscar Wilde was arrested. And I went away.
Strange thing to do with a child, isn't it?
Well, it is. The reason is this. My father was a friend of the man who wrote a book called The Trials of Oscar Wilde, and we had this book at home, and my father knew I was obsessed about this book, because it was an enormous scandal. People today have forgotten how great the scandal of 1895 was. He became a pariah. His name was taken off the theatre where his plays were being put on. He had 2 sons, and they were not told that he was put in prison. The copies of his books that he had given them, his name was taken out of his own children's copies of his own books. They didn't know whether he was alive or dead. So great was the scandal. And yes, when I was a little boy, the first non-fiction book I read was The Trials of Oscar Wilde. I moved straight from Billy Bunter and Peter Rabbit to The Trials of Oscar Wilde. It does explain a great deal. But I then met a man who was a friend of Oscar Wilde's, who was about 100 years old when I was about 13 years old, and he told me about this man. He said, you know, give me a wonderful piece of advice. Oscar Wilde told me never to commit murder, because he said a man should never do anything he cannot talk about at dinner.
Sound advice.
Yeah. Isn't he wonderful, Victoria?
He knows Oscar Wilde or Gyles?
Actually, I think Gyles, but also
One of the
Oscar.
things that we're intrigued by is that Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle became friends. They met in that particular hotel, and there's such an unlikely combination of human beings. And I'm absolutely gripped in it now. I'm writing murder mysteries about them both.
So what does
Sorry,
Wilde...
you're looking at me, you're waiting for me to say
So what does
something.
Wilde, what does Wilde mean to you then as a...
Well, apart from being a fat man on a treadmill in a prison, not a lot. I mean, I find that very overly high comedy sometimes a little bit tiresome if it's done badly. When it's done well, I think it's brilliant.
He was an extraordinary celebrity, and he was one of the first of the modern celebrities. He would have been wonderful on shows like this. He would have been a chat show's dream, and he wanted to be famous. First nights in theatres, he would go and be seen in the stalls, then a moment later, he'd be up in the gallery, then he'd appear in a box, then in another box. He used to wear a green carnation, not for any reason, but so that people would say, why are you wearing a green carnation?
You've just given us an idea. You know, they did Casualty 1900. We should do the one show 1900. We could have Oscar. Think of the people we could have on.
Yeah, real guests.
Yeah.
Oscar Wilde, the Victoria Wood of his day.
Yes.
Yeah, and he'd have liked your outfit too.
Thank you.
OK.
Excellent. That's a great idea.
Thank you, Gyles. Cheese now.